This is Beyond the Business.
If you think about it, we almost never question the air around us. It is just there. You wake up, you go outside, you move through your day, and breathing happens in the background. It does not feel like a system, it does not feel like a decision, and it definitely does not feel like something that needs to be managed. And yet, over the course of the season, every time the air was examined more closely, that simplicity started to disappear. At one point, it became a legal question: who is responsible when it is no longer safe to breathe? Then it turned into an economic one. What happens when pollution is no longer free and someone has to pay for it? Then it moved further into markets. The right to use the atmosphere becomes something that can be traded, priced, and optimized. And at the same time, none of that changes the fact that the air is still a physical reality, shaped by oceans, forests, chemistry, temperature, processes that do not adjust because a policy was introduced or a target was announced. Somewhere along the way, it becomes clear that we are no longer talking about one thing. We are looking at different layers describing the same reality. Each of those layers makes sense on its own. The problem starts when they are placed together, because that is where they stop aligning. This episode is not about introducing something new, it is about placing everything into one frame. Because once you do that, the question changes. It is no longer how air works as a concept, it becomes something much simpler, at the same time, much harder. What kind of structure have we actually built around something as basic as the air we breathe? If you stay with that thought a little longer, the first thing that changes is how air itself is understood. It is not empty space, it is a continuously operating structure, and it is far more precise than it appears. The composition of the atmosphere remains relatively stable, around 78% nitrogen and about 21% oxygen, and a small fraction of other gases. The balance developed over billions of years and stays with a narrow range that allows complex life to exist. Oxygen within that balance is not a fixed resource. It is continuously produced. Roughly 50% of global oxygen production comes from the ocean, generated by phytoplankton. These organisms represent less than 1% of global photosynthetic biomass, yet they produce roughly half of the oxygen in the atmosphere. In practical terms, every second breath is connected to biological processes happening at the surface of the ocean. This immediately shifts the perspective. This layer does not operate according to economic logic or policy decisions. It follows physical and biological processes, and at the same time, it is not isolated from human activity. Ocean temperatures are rising, and warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen. Nutrient runoff from agriculture and industry contributes to large scale algae blooms. When these blooms decay, oxygen levels in the water drop, creating low oxygen zones. In the Gulf of Mexico, seasonal zones can exceed 15,000 square kilometers. Similar patterns exist in the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and parts of the Pacific. On land, forest systems are also under pressure. Large areas continue to be cleared for agriculture, extraction, and urban expansion. This does not immediately reduce atmospheric oxygen due to the scale of the system, but it weakens the balance that sustains it. The distinction is not about depletion, it is about stability. The atmosphere is not running out of oxygen, but the processes maintaining its balance are becoming less stable. And everything else discussed in this season operates on top of this layer. This layer does not adjust to policy or markets, it responds to physical change. That is the foundation. If the system that maintains air is not guaranteed to remain stable, the next question becomes unavoidable. What does it mean to have a right to breathe? In legal terms, this question has already been addressed. Across multiple jurisdictions, environmental protection is embedded into constitutional frameworks. Governments in countries such as Germany, France, and Poland are formally required to protect environmental conditions linked to public health. At the international level in 2021, the United Nations recognized access to a clean and healthy environment as a human right. On a paper, the logic is clear. If human life depends on air and air quality directly affects health, then clean air should fall under basic human rights protection. But reality does not follow that logic. More than 90% of the global population is exposed to air pollution levels exceeding recommended safety thresholds. The World Health Organization guideline for PM 2.5 is 5 micrograms per cubic meter, a level that large parts of the world exceed on a daily basis. That is not marginal failure, it is a systemic exposure. This gap between principle and reality is where the concept of a right to air becomes unstable. Because a right implies something that can be guaranteed. Air quality cannot be guaranteed in the same way. This is where the issue moves into legal conflict. In the United Kingdom, Client Earth brought a case against the government over repeated breaches of nitrogen dioxide limits. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that the government had failed to comply with legal standards and ordered corrective action. And in 2016, the High Court ruled that the revised plan remained insufficient. Air quality became enforceable. France moved further. The Conseil d'Etat imposed fines of 10 million euros because pollution limits continued to be exceeded. Air pollution became a financial liability. In South Africa in 2022, the High Court ruled that pollution in the Highveld priority area violated constitutional rights. Air pollution became a rights violation. At the same time, outcomes remain inconsistent. In the United States, a petrochemical project in Louisiana linked to more than 6,000 tons of pollutants annually and approximately 13 million tons of greenhouse gases was initially blocked and then later approved on appeal. Legal pressure exists, but it does not guarantee change. Responsibility is distributed across energy, transport, industry, and urban systems. No single party controls the outcome. Exposure, however, is immediate. In Delhi, PM 2.5 levels regularly exceed 100 micrograms per cubic meter. In Hanoi, levels remain around 40 to 50. In Helsinki, they stay close to 4, between 6. Cleaner air is technically achievable, but not evenly distributed. If clean air is recognized as a right but cannot be delivered equally, the question becomes practical. What does that right actually mean? And who is accountable when it is not met? Because without enforceable delivery, a right remains a principle and not a guarantee. For most of human history, air had no price. It existed outside economic calculation. That changed when pollution became measured. Once emission could be quantified, they could be priced. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997 introduced the idea of integrating emissions into economic systems. Instead of banning pollution outright, governments attached a cost to it. The logic was simple. If pollution is free, it continues. If it becomes expensive, behavior changes. Today, emissions are translated into a unit, 1 ton of carbon dioxide. In the European carbon market, prices fluctuate between 60 and 100 euro per ton. For large industrial operators, this is no longer theoretical, it is a financial variable. Carbon pricing mechanisms now influence roughly 25% of global emissions. The atmosphere has entered economic governance. But pricing alone does not create a market. Trading does. Companies receive or purchase allowances. If they emit less, they sell. If they emit more, they buy. Alongside this, carbon credits allow emissions to be offset elsewhere. By 2021, voluntary markets exceeded $2 billion annually. At that point, air becomes represented. Each allowance or credit stands for a portion of atmospheric capacity. These units are traded, stored, and sometimes turned into financial instruments. But the atmosphere itself does not respond to prices. It responds to accumulation, and markets influence behavior. They do not directly reduce what is already in the air. And this is where the gap appears. Under the clean development mechanism, destroying HFC-23 generated large volumes of credit. The gas had a warming effect approximately 14,000 times stronger than CO2. Some facilities increased production to destroy more and earn more credits. The mechanism worked, but not as intended. A similar issue appeared in forest offsets. In 2023, investigations showed that in many cases, avoided deforestation baselines were overstated. Some estimates suggested that up to 90% of certain credits did not represent real emission reduction. On paper, emissions declined. In the atmosphere, nothing changed. Markets optimized around rules. They don't guarantee physical outcomes. Once air enters the market, it becomes a variable, not eliminated, but as managed. For a while, everything looks controlled. Reports show progress, targets are met, emissions decline on paper. And then something breaks that picture. In 2015, real world testing of diesel vehicles revealed emissions between 10 and 40 times above legal limit. Volkswagen had installed software to detect testing conditions. Under test, emissions dropped. On the road, they did not. The numbers were correct, and the air was not. Earlier on the carbon markets HFC 23, destructions created similar distortions. Production increased to generate more credits. The reduction became a tool and not the objective. Forest offsets followed the same pattern. If assumptions decline, the baseline outcomes depend on those assumptions. Credits were issued, transactions completed, but the atmosphere did not change. These cases reveal a pattern. Measurement defines the structure, but reality defines the outcome. System optimize around numbers, but people experience the result directly. And that difference is where the system stops working as expected. The expectation that air will improve in a straight line no longer holds. CO2 levels exceed 420 ppm. Methane exceeds 1900 ppb. Global energy demand is exceeded to increase by 20-25% by 2040 year. Pressure is not decreasing, it is shifting. In Europe, PM 2.5 declined by around 30% since 2005, but a zone behaves differently. During heat waves, it increases even when emissions fall. By 2030, heat waves are expected to intensify across Europe and North America. By 2050, zone pollution is projected to increase across Southern Europe, the United States, and China under warming scenarios approaching 2 degrees Celsius. At the same time, more than 90% of the global urban population remains exposed to unsafe air. This is not a transition, it is a divergence. Some regions improve, others remain under pressure. Many experience both at the same time. Air behaves as a variable condition, not a single trend. Management follows that reality. More than 300 cities in Europe have introduced low emission zones. Legal pressure is increasing. Financial penalties are being applied. At the same time, between 2022 and 2024, more than 30 LNG projects were accelerated in Europe. In 2023, global oil and gas investments exceed 500 billion US dollars. Part of the structure is reducing emissions, part of it's expanding capacity, and both shape the air. The outcome is uneven. Air will not improve everywhere at the same time. It will respond differently depending on local conditions, infrastructure, and constraints. Which means going forward, air will not follow a single trajectory. It will follow multiple realities at the same time. At the center of all of this, there is something that is rarely considered. The air itself is not a given. The oxygen we breathe is produced by biological processes operating over billions of years. Around 50% comes from the ocean, the rest comes from forests and ecosystems shaped by environmental balance. That balance is not fixed. Warmer oceans hold less oxygen. Algae blooms reduce oxygen levels in marine systems. Deforestation weakens the processes that sustain atmospheric stability. These changes are already being observed. And the discussion about air is not only about emissions, policy, or markets. It is also about the stability of the processes that produce the air in the first place. And those processes do not respond to financial models or regulatory timelines. They respond to physics, chemistry, and biology. Because in the end, air is not something that is managed, it is something continuously produced. And that production is no longer as stable as it was once assumed to be.